Hello and a very warm welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I am Naghma. Joining me in this conversation is Professor Harsh Pant. A couple of things that we will be looking at on this episode is the partnership between India and UAE, the trade pact that they have signed, which is very, very important, very significant. And what we will look at is how significant it is for India and UAE and what really does it mean for the India UAE relationship or India's Middle East policy? How does it strengthen that? We will look at that. We will also look at the Quad summit that took place and the consolidation of the Quad countries as a democratic grouping against the so called autocratic China. We will also look at foreign ministers' visit to Philippines, all of that. And of course, Ukraine continues to be um, a tense area where Russia says that it has no intention of attacking Ukraine, but the West, uh, as Russians call it, the West is whipping up a frenzy that Russia can attack Ukraine any moment. We will look at all of that on this episode and take some of the questions that our viewers have sent in. But let's start with the India UAE Pact. Harsh, it's very significant development that India and the UAE have signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. It is said that it is going to take forward our trade from about $60 billion to say $100 billion in a couple of years, about five years. So it is very, very significant in terms of the economic cooperation in many fields. But if we look at it from the point of view of the partnership that India and UAE have been developing and Prime Minister Modi's Middle East policy, what is it signal about that?
Thanks, Naghma. I think this is important from multiple perspectives. One, of course, is as you point out, primarily India is signaling that it is serious about economic partnerships, economic dimensions of those partnerships. That has been, after India did not join the RCEP, there have been concerns about India's integration into global economy, and I think there have been challenges on that front. The the whole paradigm of globalization has undergone a transformation in the last 2 3 years, and India also is has been for a while reluctant to sign uh, free trade agreements. This is the first free trade agreement of its kind that India has signed in almost a decade. So I think its importance is just first in terms of the symbolism that India is back in the game. And if you recall, there are a number of other free trade agreements that India is negotiating at the moment with countries like Australia, there are with the UK, with EU, even an early harvest agreement or a mini agreement with the US is on cards. But this is something where India has finally gone ahead and in a matter of I think less than 3 months concluded this agreement, which I think is in itself a very important development. That economic partnerships, the way India is trying to forge economic partnerships, which need to be more balanced in the contemporary global economic context, and where both sides actually derive benefits based on their comparative advantage, is something that India is driving home with this agreement. If you see the labor-intensive nature of some of the industries that would benefit out of this, that's quite clear what India's intent is and how India wants to take it forward. But I think the larger point here is about India UAE relations and how this new comfort level with between the two countries that has emerged. You always when you end up signing free trade agreements in particular, you need a certain kind of comfort, a political comfort, because increasingly that's how trade and economic agreements are being looked at. And the reason why countries want to move away from China, whether it is about trade or whether it is about the restructuring of supply chains, it is because of the trust factor. So increasingly, trust is becoming very, very important, and political trust is becoming very, very important when you talk of economic partnerships. And so it tells you a story about how the trust factor in this partnership has increased between India and the UAE. Now,
Yes.
UAE, of course, has been a Middle East, as you were pointing out, is a very important Middle Eastern country, and how the Middle East policy has undergone a transformation from a point where Saudi Arabia and UAE were very important partners of Pakistan. Today, they are standing with India on issues as wide ranging as trade and terrorism, and what needs to be done in the region. You would recall. India being part of the Middle Eastern so-called Quad arrangement, where a few months back, Foreign Minister Jaishankar attended the foreign ministerial level meeting between US, Israel, India, UAE. So I think the relation phenomenal transformation, and the political trust that has been engendered is allowing this relationship to move in the economic domain as well. And the signing of this agreement, the very fast conclusion of this agreement, is a testament to that effect.
Absolutely, like you pointed out, there has been a transition, there has been a shift in Middle East's approach to the world too, from standing together with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Now, Middle East opening up and actually becoming an oasis of religious harmony in West Asia, because we heard things like construction of temple taking place, and Middle East reaching out to many other countries. That reflects there is a change in the outlook there too. But Middle East, as if we talk about UAE, UAE is a very important country in the Organization of Islamic Countries, and recently, because of the hijab row that took place here in India, we also heard OIC condemning that and talking and issuing a statement. Uh, so when we talk about religious harmony and tolerance, India's image has taken a beating at the world level. Does that affect these kind of countries? The partnership with India, when you talk of trust factor, so this is all about trade and trust, but does that trust get affected by things like these?
See, anything that happens, within the country, of course, has an impact on how countries would view India's role in the world. But what I think is important sometimes is to distinguish between what happens in these multilateral platforms like OIC, where you would have multiple countries trying to position themselves in the Islamic world, versus what happens bilaterally, or even in a platform like I was discussing the Quad in the Middle East. I think the strategic priorities of countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, they are changing because they recognize that the world order is changing, that the old style reliance on oil cannot continue. You cannot be a single unit economy
Mhm.
anymore. You need diversification, not only diversification in your economy, but also diversification of economic partners. So this whole idea that you can rely on the US only is giving way to a more nuanced understanding of how the distribution of power in the world is changing, and how they need to reach out to countries in the East. And I think that is why we have seen a dramatic acceleration of ties bilaterally between Saudi Arabia and India, UAE and India. But of course, when it comes to OIC will have a different agenda. And at times they would be concerned about certain things that are happening within individual countries, and they would issue statements. And India will respond to that, and India has responded to that
Of
in its
course.
own way. So I
Yeah.
think in some ways, those aspects will not be a hindrance to the development of bilateral relationship. And as we have seen, it is under this government, under the Modi government, which has been at times criticized by on the grounds of religious discrimination. On those grounds, in fact, we have seen the development of this of India's very, very robust Middle Eastern policy. So I think strategic relationships have a logic of their own, and they will
Yes.
move forward depending on the convergence of interest, which I think is very, very strong at this point. And Mr. Modi, I think at the top level in India, has invested a lot in the Middle East, and I think there has been a lot of reciprocity. If you look at Saudi government or the UAE government, reciprocally involving themselves with India. So I think there has been this back and forth between the two countries that has, in some ways, allowed the relationship to be insulated from the internal developments.
Absolutely. In fact, very interestingly, in actually a snub to Pakistan, we've also, during this recent trade agreement, we've also heard from groups, Emirati groups, who are investing in post Article 370 Jammu and Kashmir. From, when you spoke earlier of how UAE or Saudi Arabia was standing together with Pakistan, and the shift from there now to talking about investing in Jammu and Kashmir, which Pakistan never fails to raise at any international platform.
Yes, I think that is very interesting, and I think that is also it takes the sting out of this criticism, because if you look at you know. I think the story goes back to Article 370's revocation as well. When that happened, the kind of muted criticism that we saw from several Islamic countries, and also the fact that Pakistan has been trying vociferously to internationalize the issue with little success. And now here you have, the case of various Emirati groups trying to get a foothold in Jammu and Kashmir. And if that happens, I think that would be good for the region in many ways, and it would be good for Jammu and Kashmir, for India, and for the relationship, because I think that would also signal a newfound commitment to the relationship, that even in difficult terrain, even in areas which are considered to be, which would politically be construed, relatively sensitive. There, I think the sensitivities have given way to exploration of opportunities, economic opportunities in particular. And therefore, I think Pakistan in this whole discourse has been marginalized to a considerable extent by India's outreach to these very, very important and influential Gulf countries like Saudi and UAE. And I think if UAE's intention of involving itself in Jammu and Kashmir economically comes to fruition, and that would change the dynamic altogether, because I think then this aspect of India's internal position on Kashmir being with the focus of a number of platforms like OIC would also become largely marginal.
Yes, absolutely. So we see a very, very distinct shift there as far as the Middle East is concerned. Their policy or their outlook or their outreach towards the world, much has been changing even in Saudi Arabia. We've also seen the Quad Summit take place in Melbourne, and it was very evident this time that the four countries coming together, not shying away from publicly acknowledging the grouping as a democratic answer to a more autocratic China, and bringing back the focus to the centrality of the ASEAN countries in the entire where, as far as the bigger picture of Indo-Pacific security concerns are concerned. Jaishankar choosing Melbourne to deliver a message to a country like China, with the Australian foreign minister standing by his side during the joint press conference, is also seen as an answer to the mention of Kashmir in the China-Pakistan joint statement that had come out a month back when Prime Minister Imran Khan had visited uh, China. So very interesting and very clear message this time to China.
Yes, I thought this was one of the few times that we have seen India being very, very vocal about certain things that usually in New Delhi is cagey about, in global platforms. But this time, I think gradually we are witnessing India shedding its reticence on these issues and trying to project a more confident assertion of what it feels to be its vital interests. And I think the articulation by Minister not only about India's position, here is something that is a challenge with China, because China is has not really. It has not really been keeping up its commitments. These are commitments, written commitments that China has made, and that commitment is not being followed, and therefore the challenges in Sino-Indian relations. But he also talked about trade coercion vis-a-vis Australia. When asked whether this is what has happened to Australia is trade coercion, he basically said yes, of course. This is something that has been going on for a while, and Australia has been at the receiving end. So not only projecting India's sensitivities, but also showing solidarity with a fellow Quad country like Australia, and saying that these challenges are not unique to India. This is a larger problem of China's coercive tactics, whether it is on the borders with India or whether it is on the economic front with Australia. So I think there is a larger message that increasingly India is sending, that it stands with its Quad members on areas where China is concerned. And that message came out very, very categorically I think Dr. Jaishankar saw that meeting. But I thought, what was also interesting was the larger Quad platform per se, and what it did, because I think the focus this time, from which is quite I think sensible, is was on the operational details of what do you do. What is happening to the vaccine production and cooperation among the Quad countries. What is happening to climate change and infrastructure cooperation among Quad countries. So I think there was a distinct focus on deliverables that we have now laid out the roadmap, and now we are trying to focus on what Quad as a collective can do in terms of delivery on the ground. And that, I think, came out very strongly in this meeting, with as far as the larger Quad platform is concerned. But as far as India was concerned, India bilaterally, I think, through this visit, made it very clear that the challenges with China continue, and that not only India is involved in this, but India can see that there are other countries involved. And now, I think one final point on this, which I think we also saw the the divergences being explored. That it was not as if on all issues the Quad countries were together. India made it a point that, look, on Myanmar we have a slightly different approach. We all want democratic transition, but India is not in favor of national sanctions. Similarly, on Ukraine, India was reticent in terms of articulating the position that perhaps the other three countries were articulating. So I think it was also an attempt to for India to carve out its own voice on as far as the Quad agenda was concerned. That while Quad is increasingly becoming an all-encompassing platform, there will be issues where divergences cannot be avoided, and those divergences will also have to be articulated in a manner in which I think the foreign ministers, which we saw four of them standing there and putting their countries' perspectives out there, managed to convey to the world that despite those divergences, the Quad continues to be on its way towards greater institutionalization and greater collaborative effort on the part of these four countries to map out and to operationalize a very wide agenda that they have formulated for themselves.
Um, Harsh, just a final point there on the ASEAN countries. We also saw, the centrality of the ASEAN countries. Their acknowledgement to that also, because External Affairs Minister visited Philippines after that, was very evident that Quad is focusing on the ASEAN countries and their centrality, their significance in the larger picture of the Indo-Pacific strategy or the security concerns, because Jakarta and Manila are very key to the Indo-Pacific security concerns. We've seen the Biden administration approving sale of F-15 fighters to these countries, to Indonesia. We've seen India equipping, selling BrahMos, or having a deal with Philippines for the BrahMos supersonic missiles. So the significance and the centrality of the ASEAN countries has also been acknowledged. And there is a question that one of our viewers have sent in on this. Onkar Darpe asks about how significant is Philippines for India strategically, and what are future contours of cooperation with Philippines and between Philippines and India, and views on Indonesia diversifying its defense procurement by purchasing Rafales and F-15s in place of the Russian Su-35.
ASEAN centrality is, of course, going to be key for the success of the Indo-Pacific vision. After all, ASEAN sits at the very core, at the very heart of the Indo-Pacific. And of course, ASEAN members themselves are divided on how to approach this question of China. A number of these countries, you mentioned Indonesia and Philippines and Vietnam, they are involved in perhaps direct confrontation with China on South China Sea. Some countries are more in tune with Chinese thinking, and I think that's what is putting enormous pressure on ASEAN perhaps for the first time since ASEAN was created, we have not seen this kind of divergence emerging within ASEAN. So ASEAN is at a crossroads, and what Quad and other platforms like Quad are trying to do is perhaps give some sustenance to ASEAN, and make it clear to ASEAN that ASEAN has it in itself to emerge as an anchor in the region with help of other countries. It's the only alternative is not simply following Chinese diktats. So I think it is important for countries, the Quad countries, to keep on emphasizing ASEAN centrality, and to keep on giving that level of support to ASEAN that perhaps ASEAN requires most at this critical juncture in its evolution. As far as Manila and Jakarta are concerned, where you've seen, these are the two countries, perhaps along with Vietnam, that are directly engaged with China on South China Sea. They have issues with China, and they are trying to, I think, in their own ways, resist China very, very significantly. So I think for them it is important that they start diversifying their defense requirements, not only defense requirements, but also to a certain extent economic partnerships. And that's what we are witnessing now with Indonesia, with Philippines, both of them trying to expand their ties with other like-minded countries, including India. And I think there is, in the broader sweep of things, there is no real divergence there between the Western countries and India insofar as these countries are concerned. So I think it's easier in some ways to work with the West as far as when it comes to Philippines, or when it comes to Indonesia. I think what will be important forward is how these are very important, Indonesia, Philippines, how they can shape the trajectory of ASEAN, and what kind of an outcome they expect from ASEAN trying to find its own way as the rivalry between US and China becomes more intense. And I think as we move forward, perhaps we will find that the strategic autonomy that Indonesia would want, or that Philippines would want, would take them even closer, even than what we are witnessing today towards India. I think India is a natural partner in some respects. India is an organic partner to Southeast Asia with its links in Thailand and Myanmar. So I don't think there is any real challenge here in terms of the strategic vision. What I think Indonesia and the Philippines will have to do is to coordinate their response within the larger ASEAN framework, which is not as easy as it seems, because ASEAN has grown with a common purpose and a common agenda for far too long. And as the divergences between ASEAN member states come to the fore, I think it will be important for Indonesia and the Philippines to find their own way. And I think they're doing that with Philippines now finally deciding to buy the BrahMos, and of course India finally deciding to sell BrahMos. There have been a lot of discussions for a long time. So the deal is finally done and dusted, and that's, I think, great for India from its defense manufacturing perspective, as a security provider role in the region, but also important for Philippines when it looks at diversifying its partners and diversifying its defense partners in particular. So I think we are looking at a very rapidly evolving situation in Southeast Asia, and as it looks around itself, it would find in India perhaps one of the more trusted and reliable partners.
All right. Thank you so much for that analysis. We are running out of time on this episode. There were many other questions as far as Ukraine is concerned, and India and China are concerned, but probably we'll take them up on our next episodes. We do not have much time on this one. Ukraine continues to be tense. US says that the Russian troop buildup is probably the largest since World War II, and the onus for diplomacy lies with Moscow. Now, we will keep a close watch on how things unfold on that front, but probably on our next episode. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Harsh.